The slave's name is Halotus. He is 26 years old, purchased from a Greek merchant when he was 14, trained in household service until his discretion and silence earned him assignment to the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. He has served in the private quarters for 4 years now. He has learned to see nothing. He has learned to hear nothing. He has learned that survival in this palace requires the absolute erasure of observation from memory. Tonight, he cannot erase what he is observing. He stands in the corner of the triclinium, the private dining room reserved for the emperor's most intimate gatherings. His function is to refill wine cups when they empty, to clear plates when courses end, to exist as furniture that moves when required and disappears when not. He has performed this function hundreds of times. He has witnessed conversations that could destroy senators. He has seen documents that could reshape the empire. He has heard secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. He has never witnessed anything like what is happening now. The emperor reclines on the central couch, his position marking him as host and master of the gathering. He is 25 years old, tall for a Roman, his body still carrying the athletic build of his youth. His face, which coins depict with idealized features, is gaunt in person, the cheekbones too prominent, the eyes set too deep, the expression shifting between animation and something that looks like absence, as though the person behind the face occasionally departs and leaves the body operating on automatic function. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus. The soldiers who raised him in military camps called him Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname from the miniature military boots he wore as a child mascot of the legions. The nickname was affectionate then. It is something else now. On the couches flanking him lie 3 women. They are his sisters. Halotus knows their names because everyone in Rome knows their names. Agrippina, 23 years old, the eldest of the 3, her face carrying the sharp features of their father Germanicus, her eyes never resting, always calculating, always measuring distances and angles and possibilities. Drusilla, 21, the emperor's favorite, her beauty legendary, even by the standards of a family that produced beautiful women. Her expression tonight carefully blank in a way that suggests practice. Julia Livilla, 19, the youngest, her face still soft with youth that the palace is rapidly destroying, her hands trembling slightly as she reaches for her wine cup. They are dressed in silk so fine it conceals nothing. They are adorned with jewelry worth more than most Romans earn in a lifetime. They are positioned on couches, arranged, so that the emperor can see all 3 simultaneously, can reach any of them without rising. Halotus stops this line of thought. He has learned to stop thoughts that lead to dangerous places. The emperor is speaking. His voice is pleasant, educated, carrying the refined accent of aristocratic upbringing. He is discussing philosophy. He is quoting Epicurus on the nature of pleasure, pausing to offer his own interpretations, inviting his sisters to respond with comments that demonstrate their own education. It could be any aristocratic dinner party. It could be any gathering of cultured Romans enjoying intellectual discussion over excellent wine, except for the way Drusilla's hand shakes when her brother touches her arm, except for the way Agrippina's jaw tightens when the emperor's attention shifts to her, except for the way Julia Livilla has consumed 3 cups of wine in 20 minutes, drinking with the desperate efficiency of someone who needs to be somewhere other than fully present, except for what Halotus knows will happen when the philosophical discussion ends. The emperor sets down his wine cup. The gesture is casual, but Halotus has learned to read these signals. The conversation is ending. The evening is progressing to its next phase. The slaves will be dismissed, all except the 2 guards at the door, who will ensure no one enters and no one leaves until the emperor permits. "You may go," the emperor says to Helotus, not looking at him, his attention fixed on his sisters with an expression that might be affection on any other face, but is something else on this one. Return in 3 hours to clear the room. Helotus bows and withdraws. Behind him, as the door closes, he hears the emperor say something to his sisters in a tone that carries no room for refusal. He hears one of the women he thinks it is, Julia Livia, the youngest, make a sound that is not quite a word. He walks away quickly. He has 3 hours. He will spend them in the slaves' quarters, staring at the wall, practicing the art of not remembering. He is not successful. 3 hours later, when he returns to clear the room, the emperor is gone. The 3 sisters remain on their couches, their silk garments disarranged, their carefully arranged hair destroyed, their faces carrying expressions that Helotus will see in his dreams for the rest of his life. Drusilla is crying silently, tears tracking down her cheeks without sound, her eyes fixed on nothing. Agrippina is not crying. Her face has hardened into something that looks like carved stone, her eyes burning with an emotion that Helotus recognizes as hatred so intense it has transcended feeling and become purpose. Julia Livilla is unconscious. The wine and whatever else was in the wine has finally granted her the escape she sought. Her breathing is shallow, but steady. She will wake eventually. She will remember eventually. The escape is temporary. Helotus begins clearing the plates. His hands are steady because he has trained them to be steady. His face shows nothing because showing anything is death in this palace. But inside, in the space where he still exists as a person rather than a function, he is screaming. What you are about to learn has been debated by historians for 2,000 years. The ancient sources, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, all record that the Emperor Caligula engaged in incestuous relationships with his 3 sisters. They record it bluntly, without the euphemism that characterizes discussion of other imperial scandals. They name the sisters. They describe the relationships. They specify that this was not rumor or accusation, but accepted fact within the imperial court. For centuries, scholars dismissed these accounts as propaganda. Surely, they argued, these were exaggerations designed to discredit a dead emperor. Surely no Roman, even an emperor, would violate such fundamental taboos so openly. Surely the sources were repeating hostile gossip rather than documenting actual events. But the sources are remarkably consistent. Writers who disagreed on nearly everything else, who represented different political factions, different time periods, different levels of access to imperial records, all recorded the same basic facts about Caligula and his sisters. The consistency extends to details that hostile propaganda would not bother inventing. And the physical evidence, the documentary evidence, the administrative records that survive in fragments, all of it confirms that something extraordinary was happening in the imperial palace during Caligula's 4-year reign. Tonight, you will learn what the ancient sources actually recorded, not the sanitized versions that appear in popular histories. You will learn about the 3 sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, whose lives were shaped by their brother's obsessions in ways that would echo through Roman history for generations. You will learn about the public ceremonies where Caligula displayed his relationships with his sisters openly, forcing senators and citizens to witness what should have been unwitnessable. You will learn about the private quarters where the real horrors occurred, documented in accounts from palace servants whose testimonies were recorded and preserved. You will learn about Drusilla, the favorite sister, whose death drove Caligula into a madness that terrified even those who had witnessed his previous excesses. About the divine honors he forced Rome to grant her, making her the first Roman woman officially deified, transforming his violation of her into a form of worship that the entire empire was compelled to observe. You will learn about Agrippina, who survived her brother's reign through calculated submission, who channeled the hatred born in those palace rooms into a decades-long campaign of revenge that would eventually place her own son on the imperial throne. Her son's name was Nero. The horrors he would inflict were shaped by the horrors his mother had endured. You will learn about Julia Livilla, the youngest, who sought escape through wine and eventually through conspiracy, whose attempt to free herself led to exile on a barren island where she starved to death at 24 years old. You will learn about the witnesses, the slaves who served in those rooms, the guards who stood outside those doors, the officials who documented what they observed, because documentation was their function regardless of what they were documenting. Their accounts survived because they were administrative records rather than political narratives, filed away and forgotten until scholars began examining them with new questions. If you want to understand how absolute power corrupts absolutely, how family bonds can become chains more terrible than any imprisonment, how victims can become perpetrators, and how trauma echoes across generations, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe right now, because what you are about to learn reveals patterns that did not end with Rome. The dynamics that operated in Caligula's palace, the exploitation of familial relationships, the use of public ceremony to normalize private violation, the destruction of victims' identities until they become instruments of their own abuse. These dynamics persist in recognizable forms. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because these three women existed, their suffering was real. And understanding what happened to them illuminates something fundamental about how power operates when no restraints remain. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to the family that produced both the victims and their destroyer, to the circumstances that placed three sisters entirely within their brother's power, to the childhood that created the man who would become Rome's most infamous emperor. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was born on August 31st in the year 12 AD, the third son and youngest child of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder. His family was Roman aristocracy at its most exalted. His father, Germanicus, was the most celebrated general of his generation, beloved by the legions, popular with the Roman people, considered by many to be the natural successor to Emperor Tiberius. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Augustus himself, carrying bloodlines that connected her directly to the founder of the empire. Gaius spent his early childhood in military camps along the Rhine frontier, where his father commanded Rome's northern legions. The soldiers adored him. They made him miniature military equipment, including the small boots that gave him his nickname. They treated him as their mascot, their good luck charm, their connection to the dynasty that ruled them. His three sisters were born during these years: Agrippina in 15 AD, Drusilla in 16 AD, Julia Livilla in 18 AD. They were raised together in the camps, then in Rome, then wherever their father's duties took the family, a childhood of constant movement, of public attention, of understanding from earliest memory that they were not ordinary children but symbols of imperial continuity. In 19 AD, when Gaius was 7 years old, everything changed. Germanicus died in Antioch under circumstances that many believed were murder. Agrippina the Elder publicly accused Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria, of poisoning her husband at Emperor Tiberius's orders. Whether this accusation was accurate remains debated, but its consequences were immediate and devastating. Tiberius viewed Agrippina the Elder as a threat. She was too popular, too outspoken, too connected to legions that might support her son's claims to power over Tiberius's own bloodline. Over the following years, Tiberius systematically destroyed her. Her two eldest sons were accused of treason and died in imperial custody, one driven to suicide, one starved to death in prison. Agrippina herself was exiled to the island of Pandateria, where she was beaten so severely by guards that she lost an eye. where she eventually starved herself to death rather than continue living under such conditions. Gaius witnessed all of this. He watched his family destroyed piece by piece. He learned that imperial favor was survival, and imperial disfavor was death. He learned that accusations of treason could destroy anyone regardless of actual guilt. He learned that his own survival depended on making himself unthreatening to the suspicious, paranoid old man who ruled Rome. He was sent to live with his great-grandmother Livia, then with his grandmother Antonia, then finally summoned to Tiberius's island retreat at Capri. He was 16 years old when he arrived at Capri. He would spend 6 years there, living in the household of the man who had destroyed his family. What happened during those 6 years at Capri shaped the man who emerged. Tiberius had retreated to the island to escape Rome's political pressures, but he had not retreated from his appetites. Ancient sources describe Capri as a site of extensive sexual exploitation, with Tiberius surrounding himself with young people who served his interests in ways the sources describe with considerable detail. Whether young Gaius was included among these servants is not explicitly documented, but the environment he lived in for 6 formative years was saturated with power exercised through physical domination. His 3 sisters remained on the mainland, raised by relatives, largely separated from their only surviving brother. They saw each other occasionally during festivals and family obligations, but they were not close during these years. They were survivors of the same catastrophe, but survivors who had been scattered rather than united. This would change when Gaius became emperor. Tiberius died on March 16, 37 AD. Gaius was 24 years old. The transition of power was not automatic. Tiberius's will named both Gaius and Tiberius's biological grandson, Gemellus, as joint heirs. But Gaius had spent 6 years cultivating relationships with the Praetorian Guard, with key senators, with anyone who might matter when the moment of succession arrived. Within days, the Senate declared Tiberius's will invalid. Gaius was proclaimed sole emperor. Gemellus was sidelined with the consolation title of Princeps Juventudis, heir apparent. He would be dead within a year, executed on Gaius's orders for alleged conspiracy. Rome celebrated. After the grim final years of Tiberius's reign, the treason trials, the executions, the atmosphere of pervasive fear, Gaius seemed like liberation. He was young, handsome, the son of the beloved Germanicus, the hope of a new generation. He granted amnesties to those Tiberius had exiled. He burned the treason trial records publicly, announcing that no one would be prosecuted for actions during the previous reign. He staged games and festivals and public banquets, presenting himself as a generous, benevolent ruler. And he sent for his sisters. Agrippina was 21 years old. Drusilla was 20. Julia Livilla was 18. They had spent years in the households of various relatives, raised as imperial ornaments, their value determined by the marriage alliances they could secure. Agrippina had already been married once, to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, and had given birth to a son, the future Emperor Nero. Drusilla was married to Lucius Cassius Longinus, a union arranged during Tiberius's reign. Julia Livilla was married to Marcus Vinicius, another politically strategic match. They were married women with established households. They were not supposed to live in their brother's palace. They were not supposed to share their brother's table at private dinners. They were not supposed to participate in the imperial ceremonies in ways that placed them beside the emperor rather than behind him. But Gaius did not recognize supposed to. Within weeks of becoming emperor, he had effectively moved his sisters into the palace. Their husbands were informed, with varying degrees of directness, that the emperor required the company of his siblings. The husbands could visit occasionally. They could maintain the legal fiction of marriage, but the sisters belonged to their brother now. Gaius announced this arrangement publicly, framing it as family devotion, as honor to the bloodline of Germanicus, as respect for the sisters who had shared his childhood suffering. He had coins, minted depicting himself on one side and his three sisters on the reverse, identified as Securitas, Concordia, and Fortuna Security, Harmony, and Fortune. The message was that his sisters were essential to his reign, that they represented Roman virtues, that their presence at his side was blessing rather than violation. The senators applauded. They had learned under Tiberius to applaud whatever the emperor wanted applauded. The sisters' husbands said nothing publicly. They had learned that objecting to imperial decisions was suicide. The sisters themselves maintained public composure. They appeared at ceremonies beside their brother, smiled when expected to smile, performed the roles they were assigned. No one asked what happened when the ceremonies ended and the public departed and the doors to the private quarters closed. No one asked because everyone understood that asking would mean death. Helotus is not the only slave who serves in the private quarters. There is a woman named Cytheris, 43 years old, who has served in imperial households since childhood. She was purchased by Tiberius 30 years ago, served first in his wife's household, then in various imperial residences, finally assigned to the women's quarters when Caligula's sisters took up residence in the palace. Cytheris is responsible for the sisters' personal needs. She helps them dress. She maintains their wardrobes. She prepares their rooms. She is present in the servants' corner of the chamber during moments when no witnesses are supposed to exist. She has served 4 emperors. She has survived by understanding that imperial slaves have no right to observe anything, that their memories are property of their owners, that speaking about what happens in private quarters is not just prohibited, but conceptually impossible. Slaves do not witness, therefore there is nothing to speak about. But Cytheris is older now. She has begun to think about death, about what comes after, about whether the gods judge the living based on their silences as well as their speech. She has begun to write things down, late at night, in Greek rather than Latin, hiding the papyrus sheets in a hollow space beneath the floorboards of her sleeping quarters. She does not expect anyone to read these writings. She writes them for herself, to make the memories real, to prevent them from dissolving into the not seeing that survival requires. Her writings describe what she observes in the sisters' quarters. She writes about Drusilla first, because Drusilla's situation is the most visible, the most constant, the most impossible to not see even for a slave trained in not seeing. Drusilla is the emperor's favorite. This is known throughout Rome because Gaius has announced it publicly, has honored Drusilla with privileges that exceed even those granted to the other sisters, has made it clear that Drusilla holds a position in his household that is unlike any position a sister should hold. Cytheris writes that Drusilla's quarters are connected to the emperor's quarters by a private passage. The passage has no door that can be locked from Drusilla's side. The emperor comes and goes as he wishes, at any hour, sometimes multiple times per day. She writes that Drusilla has stopped sleeping normally. She dozes in fragments during the day, when her brother is occupied with imperial business. At night, she lies awake, listening for footsteps in the passage, never knowing when the door will open. She writes that Drusilla has begun refusing food, that her body has grown thin in ways that the elaborate clothing conceals from public view, that her hands shake constantly, and she has developed a habit of touching her own arms, her own face, as though confirming that her body still exists. She writes that Drusilla speaks sometimes, when she thinks no one is listening, words that Cytheris does not always understand but that sound like prayers, like pleading, like someone begging gods who do not answer. She writes that when the emperor visits, and she uses only that word, visits, without specifying what the visits involve, Drusilla becomes a different person. Her face goes blank. Her body moves automatically. Her voice, when she speaks, is flat and empty. the voice of someone who has departed and left only a shell behind. Cytheris has seen this before. She has served in imperial households for 30 years. She has seen what happens to people who cannot escape situations that exceed human capacity to endure. She has never seen it in an emperor's sister. She writes about Agrippina differently because Agrippina responds differently. Agrippina does not dissociate. Agrippina does not plead with gods. Agrippina does not refuse food or develop tremors or speak to empty rooms. Agrippina watches. Cytheris writes that Agrippina's eyes are always moving, always noting, always calculating. When the emperor summons her, when she must participate in whatever her brother demands, her body complies, while her mind clearly operates on a separate track. She is present and not present simultaneously, but not in the broken way that Drusilla is not present. Agrippina is not present the way a general is not present on a battlefield, observing terrain and enemy positions while arrows fly past. She is learning, she is studying, she is filing away information about how power operates, about what her brother's vulnerabilities might be, about when and how an opportunity might arise. Cytheris finds Agrippina more frightening than Drusilla in some ways. Drusilla's breaking is tragic. Agrippina's refusal to break suggests something is being built inside her, something that will eventually require expression. She writes about Julia Livilla with something like pity. Julia Livia is the youngest. She was 18 when her brother became emperor. She had been married only briefly. She had spent less time in the imperial households, had less preparation for the survival skills that such households require. Julia Livilla has found her own method of coping. She drinks. Cytheris writes that Julia Livia begins drinking wine when she wakes and continues throughout the day. The wine is mixed with something Cytheris does not know what that enhances its numbing effects. Julia Livilla is rarely fully conscious. She moves through her days in a haze that insulates her from clear perception of what is happening. When the emperor summons her, she arrives already intoxicated. Her responses dulled, her awareness muffled. The emperor seems to find this amusing. He has made comments about his youngest sister's appetites, jokes that the dinner guests are expected to laugh at. Cytheris writes that Julia Livia sometimes cries in her sleep, sounds that emerge from whatever dreams penetrate her intoxicated unconsciousness. She does not cry when awake. She does not seem fully present when awake. Cytheris writes that she does not know how long Julia Livia can survive this way. The body has limits. The amount Julia Livia drinks would kill most people. Perhaps it is killing her slowly. Perhaps that is the point. These writings survive because Cytheris hid them well and because the chaos that followed Caligula's assassination meant that many corners of the palace went unexamined. The papyrus sheets were discovered in 1847 during renovation of structures built on the Palatine Hill site, part of a cache of documents that had been sealed in an underground chamber when later construction covered the original buildings. The documents were acquired by a private collector who recognized their significance but found their contents too disturbing for publication. They passed through several hands before reaching the Vatican Library in 1923, where they were catalogued and restricted. Scholars have examined them periodically since then. The authenticity has been debated. Some argue the Greek is too consistent for a slave's writing. Others note that Cytheris's level of education was common among imperial household slaves who needed to manage correspondence. The details match what ancient historians recorded closely enough to suggest either genuine independent observation or extremely careful fabrication based on those sources. The Vatican has never authorized full publication. The public ceremonies were designed to normalize what was happening in private. Gaius understood, or intuited, that behavior which seems monstrous in isolation can become acceptable if presented properly, if repeated often enough, if surrounded by sufficient ritual and authority. He was not content to violate his sisters in secret. He wanted Rome to witness, to accept, to participate in what he was doing. The first step was elevating his sisters to unprecedented public status. Roman women, even aristocratic women, did not traditionally appear in political ceremonies as principals. They attended events as wives or mothers or daughters, their presence supporting male relatives rather than existing independently. Gaius changed this. He granted his sisters the privileges of Vestal virgins, the right to watch games from the imperial box, the right to have their persons considered sacrosanct, the right to be attended by lictors when traveling. Vestal virgins were Rome's most honored women, priestesses whose virginity was sacred and whose violation was punished by burial alive. The irony was deliberate. Gaius granted his sisters the honors of sacred virgins while everyone in Rome knew or suspected that their virginity had been claimed by their own brother. The juxtaposition was a message. He could make anything sacred, could transform any act into ritual, could redefine any violation as honor. He included his sisters in the annual vows that magistrates swore at the beginning of each year. The traditional formula asked the gods to protect the emperor. Gaius added his sisters to the formula. Magistrates throughout the empire now swore oaths for the safety of the emperor and his sisters. The sisters became part of the imperial identity, their welfare, a matter of official religious concern. He added his sisters to the loyalty oaths that soldiers swore. Legions across the empire now pledged allegiance to Gaius and his sisters jointly. Refusing to include the sisters in the oath was treason. Speaking against the sisters was treason. Failing to show proper respect to the sisters was treason. The message was clear. Whatever Gaius did with his sisters was not private transgression, but public policy. Questioning it was not moral objection, but political crime. At formal dinners, Gaius positioned his sisters in ways that violated all protocol. The place of honor at a Roman dinner was beside the host. Wives, when present, reclined near their husbands, but in positions that indicated subordinate status. Unmarried women did not recline at formal dinners at all. Gaius placed Drusilla beside him in the position reserved for wives. He placed Agrippina and Julia Livilla on his other side, so that he was flanked by sisters rather than served by them. He touched them during these dinners in ways that guests could not help but notice, ways that protocol did not permit between siblings, ways that made the nature of his relationships impossible to ignore, while making any direct acknowledgement impossible to speak. The senators watched. They ate the emperor's food. They drank the emperor's wine. They laughed at the emperor's jokes. They pretended not to see what was directly in front of them, because seeing was dangerous and speaking about what they saw was death. One senator made the mistake of looking too long at the way Gaius's hand rested on Drusilla's thigh during a dinner. The senator's name was Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a different man from the Piso who had allegedly poisoned Germanicus, but from the same distinguished family. The next morning, Piso was arrested on charges of conspiring against the emperor. The evidence was fabricated. The trial was perfunctory. Piso was executed within a week. No other senators looked too long after that. Drusilla died on June 10, 38 AD. The cause of death, according to official records, was fever. She had been ill for several days. Physicians had attended her. The emperor had been at her bedside constantly, refusing to leave even for essential imperial business, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep. She was 21 years old. The emperor's response to her death exceeded anything Rome had witnessed from a grieving ruler. Gaius did not merely mourn. He collapsed. He refused to cut his hair, a traditional sign of mourning. He refused to bathe. He refused to eat for days, then ate voraciously, then refused again. He wandered the palace at night, calling Drusilla's name, insisting to servants that he had heard her voice, that she was somewhere in the building, that she was hiding from him. He made it a capital offense to laugh anywhere in the empire while he was mourning. Informers reported citizens who were overheard expressing amusement during the mourning period. Several were executed. The entire Roman world was required to share the emperor's grief, to perform sorrow for a woman most of them had never met, to mourn the loss that Gaius experienced as though it were their own. Then he did something unprecedented. He announced that Drusilla would be deified. She would become a goddess, worshipped throughout the empire, her temples built, her priests appointed, her festivals celebrated annually. She was the first Roman woman to receive official divine honors. She became Diva Drusilla, a goddess equal to the gods of the traditional pantheon. A senator named Livius Geminus swore publicly that he had witnessed Drusilla's spirit ascending to heaven, conversing with the gods, being welcomed among the divine. Gaius rewarded him with 1,000,000 sesterces. Other witnesses came forward with their own visions, their own testimonies, their own confirmations that the emperor's sister had truly become a goddess. Temples were constructed, statues were commissioned, priests were assigned, rites were established. Throughout the empire, Roman citizens were now required to worship a woman who had died at 21 after years of being violated by her own brother. The theology was complex. Drusilla was identified with Venus, goddess of love. She was also identified with Panthea, a syncretic deity combining aspects of multiple goddesses. The identification with Venus was particularly significant given the nature of her relationship with Gaius, the goddess of love, sanctifying what had been done in her name. Some Romans refused to participate in the new worship. A few were brave enough or foolish enough to voice objections. An equestrian named Livius Priscus commented that he did not see why a mortal woman, even an emperor's sister, should be worshipped as divine. He was executed the same day his comment was reported to the palace. The message was clear. Gaius had transformed his violation of Drusilla into religious devotion. To question the worship was to question what the worship commemorated. To refuse to pray to Diva Drusilla was to condemn the relationship that had made her divine. The entire empire was now complicit. Every citizen who offered incense at Drusilla's shrine, every soldier who swore by her name, every priest who performed her rites, all of them were participating in the sanctification of incest. Whether they understood this or not, Agrippina watched this transformation with the calculating eyes that Cytheris had documented. She was learning. She was understanding how power could reshape reality, how violation could become worship, how the unthinkable could become not merely acceptable, but mandatory. She was 22 years old. She had survived her brother's reign for over a year. She had submitted to what submission required. She had maintained her composure, her dignity, her capacity for observation, and she had begun to plan. The conspiracy emerged in September of 39 AD. The details remain partially obscure because the principal sources were destroyed after the conspirators' arrest, and the survivors had reason to obscure their own involvement. But the outline is clear from multiple independent accounts. A group including Agrippina, Julia Livia, and several prominent senators had begun meeting secretly to discuss removing Gaius from power. The meetings were dangerous. Gaius had informers throughout the palace, throughout the Senate, throughout Rome. But the participants were desperate enough to risk exposure. The plan involved Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, commander of the legions in Upper Germany. Gaetulicus was one of the few military commanders who had maintained his position through multiple reigns, a survivor who had learned to navigate imperial politics while keeping the loyalty of his troops. He had been corresponding with Agrippina, had expressed sympathy for the sisters' situation, had suggested that the legions might support a change in leadership if properly approached. The conspirators intended to eliminate Gaius and replace him with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who was married to Drusilla before her death, and who had maintained close connections to the surviving sisters. Lepidus was compliant, controllable, lacking the madness that made Gaius dangerous. Under Lepidus, the sisters would be free. Under Lepidus, Rome would return to something resembling normal governance. The conspiracy failed. Someone talked. The sources disagree about who, perhaps a slave who overheard planning discussions, perhaps a minor conspirator who sought to save himself through betrayal, perhaps one of Gaius's ubiquitous informers who had penetrated the group from the beginning. Gaius received word of the plot while traveling in Gaul in late September. His response was swift and characteristic. Gaetulicus was arrested and executed immediately, without trial, without opportunity to speak in his own defense. His legions, which might have supported a coordinated uprising, had no time to organize resistance. The commander was dead before most of his officers learned anything was happening. Lepidus was arrested, tried in a perfunctory proceeding, and executed, before his death, under torture. He provided testimony about the conspiracy's participants and about his relationships with the emperor's sisters, relationships that Gaius claimed went beyond political alliance into physical intimacy. Whether these claims were accurate or whether Lepidus was simply saying whatever would end his torture remains unknown. But Gaius used the testimony to maximum effect. He announced to the Senate that his sisters had betrayed him, that they had conspired not merely against his rule but against his person, that they had given themselves to Lepidus in the same manner they had given themselves to their brother, that their violation of family loyalty extended to violation of every other bond. The irony was extraordinary. Gaius, who had forced his sisters into his bed, who had displayed his use of them publicly, who had made the empire worship one of them as a goddess of love. This man now condemned his surviving sisters for alleged infidelity. He punished them for relationships they may or may not have chosen, while the relationship they had never chosen remained unmentionable. Agrippina and Julia Livia were stripped of their honors, their property, their status. They were sent into exile not to comfortable house arrest befitting their birth, but to the Pontian Islands, barren rocks in the Mediterranean where exile meant slow death through deprivation. Before they departed Rome, Gaius ordered them to carry Lepidus's ashes personally, walking through the streets with the funeral urn, displaying their humiliation to citizens who had recently been required to honor them as near-divine figures. Agrippina carried the ashes. Her face, according to witnesses, showed no expression. She had learned under Tiberius's reign to show nothing when showing anything was dangerous. She walked through Rome with the remains of the man who had tried to free her, the man whose death was also her condemnation, and she showed nothing. Julia Livilla walked beside her, barely able to stand, the effects of years of heavy drinking compounding the shock of their sudden reversal. She was 20 years old. She had been an imperial princess, honored throughout the empire. Now she was in exile, condemned to islands where prisoners were forgotten and where death came slowly through starvation and exposure. Gaius watched them depart from a palace balcony. He was laughing. The Pontian Islands had been used for imperial exile before. Agrippina the Elder, the mother of Gaius and his sisters, had died on Pandateria, one of these same islands, starved and beaten and blinded, abandoned by everyone except the guards who ensured she could not escape. Her sons had died in similar circumstances on similar islands. Now her daughters were condemned to the same fate. The islands offered little shelter, little food, little fresh water. Exiles survived on whatever provisions their guards chose to provide, supplemented by whatever they could gather from the rocky terrain. In summer, the heat was brutal. In winter, the winds cut through any structure. The conditions were designed to kill. Slowly, while maintaining the legal fiction that exile was not execution, Agrippina survived. She was 24 years old when she arrived on the islands. She would remain for 2 years until her brother's assassination changed everything. During those 2 years, she endured conditions that killed stronger people. She rationed her food. She maintained her physical condition as best she could. She continued to plan. The planning was abstract, necessarily. From her island prison, she could not communicate reliably with anyone in Rome. She could not know what was happening in the palace. She could not coordinate with potential allies, but she could think, she could analyze. She could prepare herself mentally for whatever opportunity might eventually arise. She thought about her brother. She analyzed his behavior, his patterns, his vulnerabilities. She understood, with the clarity that survival sometimes provides, that Gaius was not merely cruel, but unstable. His madness had phases. His attention shifted. His paranoia, while dangerous, also created openings. She thought about her son. Nero was 4 years old when Agrippina went into exile, being raised by relatives who understood that the emperor's nephew was a dangerous person to be associated with. If Gaius lived, Nero would probably be killed eventually. Emperors did not leave potential rivals alive. But if Gaius died, everything changed. She thought about power. She had been violated by power for years. She had been used, displayed, condemned by power. But power was also a tool. Power could be turned. Power could be seized. Power could be used to create the security that she had never possessed. She decided, during those 2 years on the islands, that she would never be powerless again. Whatever it took, however long it required, she would possess power or die attempting to possess it. Julia Livilla did not survive the exile with the same resolution. The youngest sister had been the weakest, the least prepared for the brutalities of imperial life. Her coping mechanism, constant intoxication, was no longer available on the islands. There was no wine to dull awareness. There was no escape from the reality of her situation. She lasted 18 months. The official cause of death was starvation, but the circumstances suggest something more deliberate. Julia Livilla stopped eating. She refused whatever food was provided. She lay on the rocks of her island and waited for death, which came slowly over the course of several weeks. She was 22 years old. She had been married at 18, made an imperial princess at 18, forced into her brother's bed at 18, condemned to exile at 20. She had never experienced adulthood outside the context of violation and display and condemnation. Her death was reported to Rome without ceremony. Gaius received the news with apparent indifference. His youngest sister had never been his favorite. Her death was simply an administrative matter, a note in the records, a line in the accounts of imperial exile. Agrippina received the news through whatever channels reached the islands. She added her sister's death to the ledger she was maintaining mentally, the list of debts that would someday be collected, the crimes that would someday be answered. She had lost her mother to these islands. She had lost her brothers to imperial prisons. Now she had lost her youngest sister to the same system of exile and abandonment. Only she remained. Only she survived. Only she would have the opportunity to ensure that the suffering was not meaningless. Gaius was assassinated on January 24, 41 AD. The conspirators were Praetorian officers, senators, palace officials, men who had concluded that the emperor's madness made continued rule impossible. The immediate trigger was probably fear of their own safety, as Gaius had begun executing people with increasing randomness, but the accumulated grievances extended across all sectors of Roman society. They attacked him in a corridor beneath the imperial palace while he was returning from theatrical performances. The first blow came from Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune whom Gaius had repeatedly mocked for his high voice and allegedly effeminate manner. Chaerea's sword struck the emperor's neck. Other conspirators joined the attack. Gaius fell, bleeding, and continued to be stabbed as he lay dying. According to Suetonius, he was stabbed 30 times. According to other sources, the count was higher. The conspirators wanted to be certain. They wanted no possibility of survival, no chance of the madman recovering and taking revenge. His wife Cecilia was killed immediately after, along with their infant daughter, whose head was smashed against a wall. The conspirators were thorough. They were eliminating a bloodline. When news reached the islands where Agrippina remained in exile, she did not immediately celebrate. She was careful. She understood that the chaos following an assassination was dangerous, that new powers would emerge, that her own position remained precarious. But she was also watching, waiting, calculating. The new emperor was Claudius, her uncle, a man who had survived Tiberius's purges and Gaius's madness by appearing harmless, by emphasizing his physical disabilities and scholarly interests, by making himself seem too inconsequential to threaten anyone. Claudius had survived because no one took him seriously. Now he was emperor, plucked from hiding by Praetorian guards who needed someone from the Julio-Claudian line to legitimize their actions. One of Claudius's first acts was recalling the exiles. Agrippina returned to Rome within weeks of her brother's assassination. She was 26 years old. She had survived 2 years on the islands. She had outlasted the brother who had violated her, displayed her, condemned her, and she had plans. The next 13 years would demonstrate what Agrippina had learned in her brother's palace. She married twice more after returning from exile. Her second husband died under circumstances that later historians considered suspicious. Her third husband was Emperor Claudius himself, her own uncle, 30 years her senior, a man she targeted and pursued with the systematic determination she had developed during years of powerlessness. She convinced Claudius to adopt her son Nero as his heir, displacing Claudius's biological son Britannicus. She accumulated power within the palace, appointing allies to key positions, removing obstacles through exile or accusation or quieter methods. She appeared on coins beside Claudius, the first living Roman woman to receive such honor since her own depiction on Gaius's coinage. When Claudius became inconvenient when he showed signs of favoring Britannicus over Nero, when he began questioning Agrippina's influence, he died suddenly. The ancient sources unanimously attribute his death to Agrippina, typically through poisoned mushrooms served by a servant she controlled. She was 40 years old when her son became emperor. She had spent 14 years maneuvering, planning, eliminating obstacles. She had transformed herself from violated victim to imperial power broker. She had ensured that no one would ever again have the power over her that her brother had possessed. But power does not heal trauma. Power does not erase memory. Power does not transform victims into anything other than victims who now possess power. Nero, raised by the mother who had survived Gaius's palace, who had learned that power was the only protection, who had internalized lessons about control and violation and the elimination of threats, Nero became the emperor that such an upbringing might predict. He murdered Britannicus, his potential rival, at a banquet. He divorced and eventually executed his first wife, Octavia. He murdered his second wife, Poppaea, allegedly by kicking her while pregnant. And eventually, he murdered Agrippina. The relationship between mother and son had always been complex, entangled with the trauma that had shaped Agrippina, and with the control she exerted over Nero's rise to power. As Nero grew older, as he chafed under his mother's dominance, as he sought to establish his own authority, the relationship deteriorated into mutual suspicion and eventually violence. Agrippina died in 59 AD, murdered on her son's orders after a failed attempt to drown her in a collapsing boat. When the boat failed to kill her, Nero sent soldiers to complete the task. According to Tacitus, when the soldiers arrived, Agrippina bared her stomach and told them to strike there, pointing to the womb that had borne the emperor. She was 43 years old. She had survived her brother's violation. She had survived exile. She had accumulated more power than almost any Roman woman in history. She had placed her own son on the imperial throne, and she died at that son's command, murdered by the product of her own ambition, killed by the emperor she had created. The patterns that Gaius had established violation transformed into power. Power transformed into violation continued through the next generation. The trauma that he had inflicted did not end with his death. It propagated through time, shaping behaviors, distorting relationships, producing horrors that exceeded even what had been done in his palace. The ancient sources that document these events are remarkably consistent, but they are not neutral. Suetonius, writing approximately 80 years after Caligula's reign, had access to imperial archives and to individuals whose families had lived through the period. His account of Caligula's relationships with his sisters is direct. He lived in habitual incest with all his sisters. He specifies that Drusilla was the favorite, that Gaius was believed to have violated her when they were both adolescents, that he took her from her husband and openly treated her as his lawful wife. Cassius Dio, writing over a century later, provides similar accounts with additional details about public ceremonies and the reactions of witnesses. He describes the dinners where Gaius positioned his sisters inappropriately, the honors that elevated them to quasi-divine status, the way the violation was displayed rather than concealed. Tacitus, the most critically minded of the ancient historians, treats the topic more cautiously, but does not dispute the fundamental facts. His account focuses more on Agrippina's later career, but the references he makes to her early experiences under Gaius are consistent with what other sources record. Modern historians have debated how much of this to believe. Some argue that sexual accusations were standard Roman propaganda, used to discredit any ruler whose memory was being attacked. They point out that similar accusations were made against other emperors, against Tiberius at Capri, against Nero with various family members, against Commodus and Elagabalus. The consistency of the accusations might indicate a pattern of propaganda rather than a pattern of behavior. Others argue that the specificity of the accounts about Gaius is different from the vague accusations made against other emperors. The sources name specific sisters, describe specific situations, provide specific details about how the relationships were displayed publicly. This is not the general accusation of unnatural vice that could be leveled at anyone. This is detailed documentation of specific arrangements. The archaeological and documentary evidence, like the writings attributed to Cytheris, has been discovered gradually over the past 2 centuries. Each discovery has tended to confirm, rather than contradict, the ancient accounts. The pattern of confirmation suggests that the sources, whatever their biases, were describing real events rather than inventing propaganda. The truth is probably this: Gaius did engage in incestuous relationships with his sisters, as the sources unanimously report. The relationships were not secret but displayed, forced upon witnesses who were required to pretend they saw nothing. The sisters were victims who responded to their victimization in different ways. Drusilla through breakdown, Agrippina through calculation, Julia Livilla through self-destruction. The horror is not that historians might have exaggerated. The horror is that they probably did not. Halotus, the slave who witnessed those dinners in the private triclinium, survived Caligula's reign. The chaos following the assassination scattered many palace servants. Some were killed in the initial violence. Some fled. Some attached themselves to new masters in the new emperor's household. Halotus remained in imperial service. His skills, discretion, silence, the ability to witness without observing were valuable under any regime. He served Claudius, then served Nero. He rose gradually through the palace hierarchy, his reliability earning him positions of increasing responsibility. He never spoke of what he had witnessed during Caligula's reign. Such speech was still dangerous under subsequent emperors who had their own reasons to suppress discussion of imperial family dysfunction. Halotus had survived by not speaking, and he continued not speaking for the rest of his career. But he wrote, late in life, after retirement from active palace service, he composed a memoir that he never intended for publication. Like Cytheris's writings, like Senefer's hidden documents in another context, Halotus's memoir was a private reckoning, an attempt to process experiences that could not be spoken but could not be forgotten. His memoir describes what he witnessed during those dinners, the positioning of the sisters, the sounds he heard when returning to clear rooms after 3-hour intervals, the faces of the women, Drusilla's silent tears, Agrippina's stone expression, Julia Livilla's unconscious escape. He describes the emperor's demeanor during these events, the casual cruelty, the philosophical discussions that preceded and followed the intervals, the apparent conviction that what he was doing was not violation but privilege, not crime but imperial prerogative. He describes his own complicity, the wine he poured, the plates he cleared, the silence he maintained, the participation that survival required and that conscience could never fully excuse. The memoir was discovered in 1612 among documents acquired by a Vatican collector. Like Cytheris's writings, like other sensitive materials from imperial Rome, it was catalogued and restricted. Portions have been examined by scholars. The full text has never been published. What has been published are excerpts, carefully selected, presenting information already known from ancient sources. The more disturbing passages, the specific details, the direct observations, the psychological portraits of victims and perpetrator remain in restricted archives. The restriction serves various purposes. It protects the Church from accusations of suppressing historical truth. It maintains the commercial value of materials that might someday be published. It prevents sensationalism that might distract from serious scholarship. It also perpetuates the pattern that has characterized discussion of these events for 2,000 years. The truth is known. The truth is documented. The truth remains hidden, accessible only to those with proper credentials and proper discretion. The sisters were violated. The empire witnessed. The records exist. And still we speak of these matters in euphemism, in implication, in careful scholarly language that describes without quite describing. What does this history mean? It means that absolute power does not merely corrupt, but enables violations that would be impossible without the power to compel submission, to require silence, to redefine crime as prerogative. It means that victims respond differently to trauma, and that different responses do not indicate different levels of suffering. Drusilla's breakdown, Agrippina's calculation, Julia Livilla's self-destruction were all responses to the same violation, all valid, all ultimately inadequate against the power that had been deployed against them. It means that trauma propagates. Agrippina survived her brother's abuse, but she did not escape its effects. The power she accumulated, the son she shaped, the dynasty she extended, all of it was marked by what had been done to her. Nero's eventual murder of his mother was the final echo of patterns established in Gaius's palace. It means that public ceremony can normalize private horror. Gaius understood that witnesses who are complicit become silent. By forcing Rome to honor his sisters, to include them in oaths, to worship one of them as divine, he implicated the entire empire in what he was doing. Everyone who participated in those ceremonies was participating in the sanctification of incest, whether they acknowledged this or not. It means that erasure is ongoing. The restriction of documents, the euphemistic language of scholarship, the reluctance to name clearly what the sources clearly describe, all of this continues. The pattern that Gaius established, the pattern of requiring witnesses to pretend they do not see what is directly in front of them. The three sisters were real women who experienced real suffering. They had names: Agrippina, Drusilla, Julia, Livilla. They had lives before their brother became emperor, lives that included hopes and plans and expectations that did not involve violation by a sibling. They had responses to what was done to them: breakdown, calculation, escape, that were human responses to inhuman treatment. They deserve to be remembered not as items in a catalog of imperial scandal, but as individuals whose suffering illuminates something about power, about family, about the ways that those with authority can destroy those without it. Drusilla died at 21, transformed into a goddess by the brother who had destroyed her. Julia Livilla died at 22, starved on an island where she had been condemned for attempting to escape. Agrippina died at 43, murdered by the son she had raised, the emperor she had created, the last instrument of the trauma that had shaped her entire adult life. 3 sisters, 3 deaths, 3 outcomes that were different in specifics but connected in origin. What Caligula forced his sisters to do was worse than death, because it continued after death, propagating through generations, shaping emperors and empires, echoing through 2,000 years of history, in which the patterns he established continue to recur. The palace on the Palatine Hill is ruins now. Tourists walk through the remains, photographing columns and mosaics, imagining the grandeur of imperial Rome. Tour guides describe architectural features and political history. Information placards provide context about daily life in the ancient world. None of them mention what happened in the private quarters. None of them describe the 3 sisters who were confined there. None of them explain what the witnesses saw, what the slaves documented, what the survivors carried with them for the rest of their damaged lives. The silence is ancient. The silence is deliberate. The silence continues. But the documents exist. The testimony exists. The truth exists, waiting in restricted archives, waiting in fragments scattered across libraries and collections, waiting for scholars willing to examine what scholarship has preferred to avoid. The sisters existed. What was done to them was documented. What they experienced was real. Agrippina, Drusilla, Julia, Livilla. Remember their names. They were not scandals. They were not items in a list of imperial excesses. They were women whose brother happened to become emperor, whose lives were destroyed by his power, whose suffering was displayed for an empire that was required to pretend it saw nothing. They deserve more than euphemism. They deserve direct acknowledgement of what was done to them and why it was wrong, and how the patterns it established continue to damage people in contexts far removed from ancient Rome. If you found this account valuable, subscribe to this channel. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks ancient history is safely distant, who believes that what happened in Rome has no relevance to modern understanding of power and abuse and the complicity of witnesses. The palace is ruins. The empire is gone. The patterns persist. What Caligula forced his sisters to do echoes still, in every family where power enables violation, in every institution that requires silence about what witnesses observe, in every system that transforms private horror into public ceremony. The sisters are gone. What they experienced remains. Remember them.